Hello there, I'm glad you made it. I'm Hyperdulia and welcome to the show. It's not been that long this time. Welcome back to Pentateuch week. And my hair's always been this color and you're going crazy. Quick recap of what this is. I am not a religious person and I am trying to read the Bible cover to cover in a short amount of time. It was going to be a year, but it's not going to be a year. And then I give y'all the lowdown on what each book in the Bible even is, who wrote it, how it's structured, what happens in it, and what the interesting parts are, and whether you should read it too, regardless of your faith. So this is part 2 of 5 of Pentateuch Week, where I talk about the first 5 books in the Bible. If you haven't seen the Genesis video, I recommend that you do, because Genesis goes before Exodus, but you can honestly pick and choose depending on what books pique your interest. I will include a link to the Genesis video in the description below if you're curious. The YouTube algorithm and I both appreciate your views, so if that interests you at all, give it a watch. But that out of the way, let's actually start talking about Exodus. Exodus, or as it's called in Hebrew, Shemot, which is the names in Hebrew, is the uncontested second book of the Bible and, of course, the Pentateuch. It spans from the end of Genesis, which, as we remember, sees the progenitors of the tribes of Israel, minus Joseph, R.I.P., living in Egypt, and spans all the way to the creation of the tabernacle, i.e. the portable temple that housed God, and it antecedes and foreshadows, in a way, the historical temples of Jerusalem, and of course the temple as a place of congregation and prayer in modern-day Judaism. Exodus, like the rest of the Torah, is traditionally thought to have been written by Moses, who is the kind of main character in the Pentateuch, and there are some parts where the book seems to play into this belief and seems to know that people think that it's written by Moses. But this is most likely a case of pseudepigraphy, which is the attribution of a work to a more famous author for whatever reason. It can be to add it some legitimacy, it can be for political reasons, we're not entirely sure. But we know that it might be a case of pseudepigraphy because there are inconsistencies in things like names. So for example, Mount Sinai, which is the mountain of revelation, in some places is also called Horeb, and it seems to go back and forth. Therefore, it's better understood, like the rest of the Torah, to be a composition of various traditions across both regions and time. So there are some traditions whose strands we can actually follow, and I'm going to list them out. They are the Yahvist for J, the Elohist for E, the Deuteronomist for D, and the priestly author for P. And the timeline of how these traditions came together to form what we now think of as the Torah looks something like this. However, these are not the only voices in the mix, far from it. Actually, unknown redactors and editors are responsible for deciding which traditions were legitimate and then weaving them into the form that we have today. There is truly an unknowable amount of authors that worked on and added to and took away from the Torah. So like I said last video, and we'll probably say in all the other ones, this issue is super complex. I'm giving you the very simplified version, and there's a ton more to be said about it, but that's the long and short of it. Cruising right along into structure, Exodus is basically divided into thirds, which is convenient for me. So part 1 deals with Israel in Egypt, where we left them, most significantly with the Exodus itself into the wilderness. This includes many narrative points that are probably familiar to you, such as the encounter with the burning bush, the 9 marvels or plagues, and the crossing of the Red Sea to escape from Egypt. The second part deals with revelations on Mount Sinai from God to Moses, as well as the initial covenant, that is the 10 Commandments and their associated laws. Part 3 involves the renewal of the covenant following the worship of the golden calf, which kind of muddies the original covenant's waters, before including the account of the construction of the tabernacle. Exodus, like Genesis before it, primarily relies on the narrative to move it along, but it covers a much shorter period of time. Remember, Genesis covers from the creation of the world up until this point. I mean, depending on who you ask, that's at least like 1600 years of history. Meanwhile, over the course of the rest of the Torah, there's kind of one main character in Moses. He's front and center, so a lot less time passes. This is excluding the very beginning of Exodus, where it kind of fast forwards all the way from Joseph and his family up to Moses. And where Genesis is concerned with these extensive, sprawling genealogies, Exodus instead focuses on law-giving, much like a lot of the rest of the Pentateuch. Moses' primary role, aside from being the spiritual leader, is to pass down from God laws governing this now significant community, as well as enforcing these laws as necessary. In that way, he becomes sort of a political leader as well. Law-giving, aside from the stories of Israelite lineage and origins, is kind of the central element of the Torah that makes it so relevant throughout Jewish history to the present day. Enough about that, let's get to the juicy stuff. What actually happens in Exodus? Exodus isn't quite as long as Genesis, and it covers a much shorter period of time, but it's still chock full of narrative drama. In fact, you can assume I'm leaving more out here because the stories can actually get pretty detailed since we're zooming in on a more specific period of time. Basically, here's the extreme TLDR. So first we learn that a significant period of time has passed, around 430 years, and it starts with a brief genealogy that connects Israel and his sons down to Moses, which marks the transition from a single family to a group of Hebrew tribes. It's a community now, it's not just this guy and his kids. And unfortunately for them, the current pharaoh of Egypt is kind of a dick, and he has enslaved and is oppressing the Israelites to the point of genocide. Moses, who is a Hebrew, is actually sent down the river to escape being killed by the Egyptians, and is rescued by the sympathetic Pharaoh's daughter. Later on, Moses becomes disillusioned with the Egyptian royalty and experiences a meeting with God. So this is the burning bush story. He then becomes a prophet and organizes an exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt after attempting to reason with the Pharaoh. This exodus culminates in the parting of the Red Sea, which, side note, should probably be called the Reed Sea. This area is describing the marshland of northern Egypt and not the Red Sea that we all know and love and are big fans of today. The Israelites then wander in the wilderness for a hot minute and have generally a pretty bad time. They don't have, water, they don't have food, they don't have shelter or any sort of protection. They're kind of lacking the most basic human needs. So God helps them out a little bit, and in this process gives them a bunch of rules they have to follow. This is the Ten Commandments part, which precedes further law giving in the chapter. These laws consist of pretty basic stuff like, don't commit murder, and whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death, and when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. This section also includes the plans for making the tabernacle, which is kind of random because they hadn't actually built it yet. Then everyone gets bored of waiting around for Moses to stop talking to God on Mount Sinai all day, so they make a golden calf to worship instead, which is way shinier and way more fun. And Moses comes back down the mountain and does not enjoy this. Fun story here, Moses is so pissed off about this violation of the covenant that he incites a civil war between the beta cow lovers and the alpha Elohim enjoyers, with an apparent death toll of 3,000 people. That's not really a hidden secret, but I feel like people tend to leave that out of the golden calf story, and I think it's really fun. Moses and God make up, and God restores the covenant with Israel and gives them some more laws they have to follow. Then the tabernacle is actually built, and God makes a house a home and moves in. Now let's get into the things that I personally thought are interesting and want to share or bring to your attention. So the first thing that I wanted to bring up that piqued my fancy has to do with the Ten Commandments, which are also called the Decalogue, because the jury is kind of still out on what they are. Different Jewish and Christian traditions actually have different lists of the Ten Commandments, which I was not aware of. So, for example, the text says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." Well, most Jewish traditions, as well as Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, and most Protestant churches, consider this to be one commandment, that is the 10th commandment. But Roman Catholic and Lutheran churches break this into two commandments, not to covet your neighbor's wife, and not to covet your neighbor's goods, which, depending on how you look at it, could be kind of progressive. As another example, consider this quote from Exodus 20. "I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Pop quiz. How many commandments do you see there? Roman Catholics and Lutherans see 1. This is their first commandment. But many Jewish traditions see 2. They break up the divine self-identification of I am the Lord your God to be the first, and then the command not to worship other gods and not to make idols as the second. Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, and Protestant churches also see 2, but they don't acknowledge the divine self-identification to be one of them. Instead, their first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me, but have a separate commandment forbidding idols, which has really interesting implications for how each tradition sees the connection between idols and other gods. Are they one and the same? Does an idol constitute another god? Or is there a difference between an idol and a legitimate alternative deity? So cool. Next up, I want to talk about some of these laws, man. The laws in Exodus 20.22 to 23.33 are what's known as the Covenant Code. And these are the oldest legal materials in the Pentateuch and some of the oldest ones in the Bible. And while they're not really applicable to society today, they're still seen as pretty relevant to the fine print of this covenant between God and Israel. Some of them have also been used for some pretty interesting reasons throughout history. So, for example, there's one that says, you shall not permit a female sorcerer to live, which leaves a particularly sour taste in my mouth, as do laws like, quote, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. Laws like this are included despite Exodus's primary theme being liberation from oppression and slavery. Furthermore, as I've alluded to, some of them are a little on the extremely specific for no reason side. A lot of them are totally unusable if you consider the life in the wilderness that the Israelites were living at this time. So what gives? Well, the short answer is the laws of Hammurabi give. Whoever wrote the Covenant Code must have been intensely familiar with these laws of Hammurabi, to the point where parts of this are basically plagiarism. You remember that weird law I read about what to do when an ox gores someone? Well, check out this passage from the laws of Hammurabi. If an ox gores an awilam, or free man, while passing through the street and kills him, that case has no claim. These similarities are countless, although some parts, like the amount fined if an ox gores a slave, are changed to better suit the particular needs of the community, although this community is not ostensibly the one being described as wandering in the wilderness. Even the famous eye for an eye motif described in Exodus 21.23 comes straight from the laws of Hammurabi. Quote, if an awilam blinds the eye of a member of the awilam class, they shall blind his eye. So basically, the professor of whoever wrote Exodus probably needs to hear about this one, because this is some explosion-worthy stuff right here. What probably happened is that the author of this section saw the laws of Hammurabi as a reasonable legal framework that they could build upon and alter, sort of like how nations today use a constitutional framework but write their own constitutions. Now, my last point of interest has to do with the Decalogue itself, or more aptly, the 2 stone tablets that it's famously carved on. So if you're like me, you had this image of, 5 on one, 5 on the other, which, as we just discussed, might be tricky considering nobody can agree on what each individual commandment is. You might have even seen this great clip floating around.
All pay heed! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 10 commandments!
The 2 stone tablets actually comes from a tradition in the Near East around this time when it came to treaties. Basically, the sovereign and the vassal would retain separate and complete copies of the treaty, often on 2 identical carved tablets. So, this medium of carved tablets is meant to signify God's role as a sovereign protecting his vassal, i.e. Israel. And that this treaty is carved in this way creates added legitimacy for the covenant between God and Israel. But what I think is most interesting about this is that usually these copies are separated, obviously, one for each party, whereas God gives Moses both copies, and then when the tabernacle is constructed later, both are stored in the Ark of the Covenant, which is the fancy chest that holds these tablets to signify the covenant exists. They store both of them in there, in the same place, together, on earth, but in the tabernacle that God resides in. It's just such an interesting symbolism of not just God being with these chosen people, but the sovereign literally living in the same space as the vassal. I used to think that the tablets were just there to communicate the Decalogue, but they're actually charged with an immense amount of symbolism that I think is pretty rad. Okay, the meat and potatoes are over. Let's get to the bill. Should you read Exodus? Yes, mostly. I think the narrative in Exodus transitions smoothly from Genesis, and it covers a lot of fun stories that you may have heard regurgitated, but not necessarily gotten the full details of. Like, remember when Moses just straight up kills an Egyptian guy for beating up a Hebrew in Exodus 2? You remember that? You remember? I didn't either. That said, there are some parts of this you can probably afford to skip. The tabernacle instructions and construction are especially tedious and take up a pretty sizable chunk of Exodus. And I think the Covenant Code is super fun, but I understand why it might not be for everyone. It took me a little longer to read Exodus than it did Genesis, probably around 2 to 3 weeks, partly because I got really busy, but also partly because there's some seriously slow sections that can be tough to chew through if you want to get to the juicy bits. But they're worth it in my opinion. If you've read Exodus and have anything that I missed that you'd like to share, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to learn more. But otherwise, I'm signing off. I will see you guys tomorrow when we talk about the book of Leviticus. And yeah, until next time, thanks for watching.
I got more than 50 shades of gray, living in a house of blue.
Oh, you're back really early. He just like gored someone. I was gonna stone him to death. Urgh.